Hirohito sat alone in the sweltering underground bunker beneath the imperial palace, his white-gloved hands trembling as he held a piece of paper that would change history forever. Outside, Tokyo lay in ruins, a charred skeleton of what had been one of Asia's greatest cities. But what the emperor was about to do had never been done in Japan's 2,600-year history, and many of his own generals would rather see the nation burn to ash than allow it. The palace walls still echoed with the gunfire from just hours earlier, when a group of young officers had attempted to steal the recording he'd just made. They'd failed, but barely. Now, as dawn broke on August 15, 1945, Hirohito knew that in mere hours, his voice would broadcast across Japan for the first time ever, and the words he would speak were so unthinkable that he'd had to cloak them in language so cryptic, many Japanese wouldn't even understand what he was saying. But 7 men in a room 3 floors above him were plotting to make sure that broadcast never happened. Chapter 2: The Coup That Almost Succeeded. Major Kenji Hoshinaka paced like a caged animal in the officers' quarters, his uniform soaked with sweat and someone else's blood. Just 4 hours ago, he and his fellow conspirators had murdered Lieutenant General Takashi Mori, the commander of the Imperial Guards, after Mori refused to join their coup. They'd then forged the general's orders and taken control of the Imperial Palace grounds, cutting all phone lines and sealing every entrance. For a brief, intoxicating moment, Hoshinaka had held the emperor himself as a virtual prisoner. His mission had been simple: find the recording of the emperor's surrender speech and destroy it before it could be broadcast at noon. He'd torn through the palace like a madman, ransacking rooms, terrorizing staff, even threatening the emperor's chamberlain with his pistol. But the recording had vanished, as if it had never existed. Now, as the sun climbed higher and his window of opportunity narrowed, Hoshinaka realized someone had outsmarted him. What he didn't know was that the 2 records containing the emperor's voice were hidden in the most obvious place imaginable, a location so mundane that his soldiers had walked past it 17 times without a second glance. Chapter 3: Hidden in Plain Sight. Tokugawa Yoshihiro, the chamberlain of the imperial household, had barely slept in 3 days, and now he understood why. At 3 a.m. that morning, he'd made a decision that probably saved Japan from descending into absolute chaos. When he'd heard boots thundering through the palace corridors and realized a coup was underway, he'd grabbed the 2 records containing the emperor's surrender speech and hidden them in the one place the fanatic young officers would never think to look, among a stack of documents in a humble aide's office, wrapped in cloth and tucked into a basket of papers marked a routine correspondence. While Hoshinaka and his men had ransacked the broadcasting room, the recording studio, and even the emperor's personal chambers, they'd ignored the administrative offices entirely. Soldiers always did. Now, as 8 a.m. approached and government officials quietly retook control of the palace, Tokugawa retrieved the records with shaking hands. They felt impossibly fragile, these 2 shellac discs that contained the voice of a living god announcing defeat. But getting them to the Nippon Husu Kyukai (NHK) broadcasting station across the city would be another challenge entirely, because Hoshinaka and his co-conspirators were still loose in the streets of Tokyo, armed and desperate. And they'd just learned where the records were going. Chapter 4: The Race Against Fanatics. The car carrying the emperor's records moved through the devastated streets of Tokyo like a ship navigating through icebergs. Driver Shuichi Nishikawa kept his eyes locked forward, hyper-aware that at any moment, a fanatic officer could step into the road and open fire. In the back seat, 2 officials cradled the records as if they were newborns, because in a way, they were. These discs would give birth to a new Japan, one that had never existed before. A Japan that had surrendered. Every few blocks, they'd encounter checkpoints manned by confused soldiers who didn't know if they were supposed to be stopping a coup or joining one. Some waved them through. Others raised their rifles with uncertain eyes, fingers on triggers, until a senior officer would bark an order and the barricade would part. The journey that should have taken 15 minutes stretched into an agonizing hour. Meanwhile, at NHK headquarters, technicians were making their own desperate preparations, because they'd received intelligence that made their blood run cold. A group of army officers was en route to the station, and their orders were simple: destroy the broadcasting equipment before noon, by any means necessary. The engineers had one advantage: they knew something about those records that even the Emperor's staff didn't know, something that could render this entire mission worthless. Chapter 5: The Technical Nightmare. Chief Engineer Hachiro Goto stared at the playback equipment in the NHK studio and felt his stomach drop. The records had arrived safely. That was the good news. The bad news was far worse. The Emperor's speech had been recorded on large, fragile shellac discs using specialized equipment, and played back at a precise speed. But when Goto carefully placed the first disc on the turntable for a test run, what emerged from the speakers made everyone in the room freeze in horror. The Emperor's voice was distorted almost beyond recognition, warped, slowed, making him sound drunk or drugged. In their panic to hide the records and transport them across Tokyo, someone had slightly damaged the discs, or perhaps the recording had been floored from the beginning. Either way, if they broadcast this, the Japanese people wouldn't just hear their emperor surrender, they'd hear him sound like a fool, which would be a humiliation beyond measure. Goto had less than 3 hours to solve a problem that should have taken days. He sent junior engineers scrambling for alternative turntables, different needles, anything that might help. But then a messenger burst through the door with news that made the technical problems seem trivial. The army officers had arrived, and they brought grenades. Chapter 6: The Siege of NHK. Colonel Takeo Endo stood in the NHK lobby with 4 other officers, each man carrying not just sidearms but satchels that bulged ominously. They weren't part of Hutchinarka's failed palace coup, but they were inspired by it, true believers who'd rather see Japan fight to the last man, woman, and child than surrender to the Americans. Endo's logic was simple and terrifying: no broadcast equipment, no surrender announcement. No surrender announcement. No surrender. He demanded access to the broadcasting floor, and when the station manager refused, Endo had calmly placed one of his satchels on the reception desk, opened it to reveal the grenades inside, and repeated his request. But what Endo didn't know was that NHK director Daitaro Arakawa had been expecting something like this. While Endo and his men had been making their way through the building, Arakawa had already activated Protocol 7, a contingency plan that only 3 people in the building knew existed. Even as Endo climbed the stairs toward the main broadcasting studio, technicians were secretly routing the audio cables to a backup control room in the basement, one that Endo didn't know existed. It was a desperate gamble, but if they could stall Endo's group for just 90 more minutes, they might be able to broadcast the Emperor's speech even if the main studios were destroyed. Then a gunshot rang out, followed by screaming, and Arakawa realized that someone had just made a choice that changed everything. Chapter 7: The Gunshot That Almost Changed History. Junior engineer Saburo Miyamoto lay bleeding on the studio floor, clutching his shoulder where Colonel Endo's bullet had torn through muscle and chipped bone. Miyamoto's crime had been simple. He'd physically blocked the door to the main control room, refusing to move even when Endo pressed his pistol against his forehead. Endo hadn't wanted to shoot. The gunshot would alert everyone in the building. But Miyamoto had looked him in the eye and said something that made the colonel's decision for him: "You'll have to kill every person in this building. Are you prepared to murder 50 Japanese citizens to stop 50 words?" Endo had pulled the trigger. Now, as Miyamoto's colleagues dragged him to safety and Endo's men forced their way into the control room, the situation had escalated beyond anyone's control. The police had been called, but they were scattered and disorganized after yesterday's chaos. Military police were en route, but the question was whose orders they'd follow, the Emperor's or the fanatics. In the basement, Chief Engineer Goto made a decision that violated every broadcasting regulation in existence but might save everything. He would start the broadcast early. Not the Emperor's speech itself, but a pre-announcement, something to buy time and create witnesses. If thousands of Japanese people were already tuned in, waiting for the emperor's words, Endo couldn't destroy the equipment without committing an act against the entire nation. Goto reached for the microphone, but his hand never made it, because at that exact moment, the backup generator failed. Chapter 8: Darkness and Decisions. The basement studio plunged into absolute darkness, and in that darkness, Goto heard a sound that made his blood freeze: laughter. Bitter, exhausted, on their edge of madness laughter from his assistant engineer, who'd been working for 36 hours straight. "The generator's dead," the assistant said between gasps. "We forgot to check the fuel. After everything, the coup, the damaged records, the fanatics with grenades, we're going to fail because we forgot to check the fuel." But Goto's mind was already racing. The main building still had power. Endo hadn't cut that yet because he needed it to verify the equipment was destroyed. Which meant there was still one option, but it was so dangerous that even thinking about it made Goto's hands shake. They could run a cable from the main studio to the basement, bypassing all the safety systems and protocols. If they made even one mistake, the electrical feedback could not only destroy the Emperor's recording but potentially start a fire that would consume the entire building. And they'd have to run that cable through corridors that Endo's men were actively patrolling. Goto looked at his team in the darkness, 5 engineers who'd barely eaten or slept, who'd sacrificed everything to get to this moment. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He didn't give an order. He didn't assign the task. He simply said, "I need a volunteer for something that will probably kill you." Every hand went up. Chapter 9: The Cable Run. Engineer Yuki Tanaka moved through the corridors of NHK like a ghost, or perhaps like a dead man who didn't know it yet. The cable he was running weighed nearly 40 pounds, hundreds of feet of copper wire wrapped around his shoulder and waist, digging into his skin, every step an agony. Above him, he could hear Endo's men still searching the upper floors, their boots heavy on the ceiling. Twice, he had to freeze in complete stillness as a soldier passed within arm's reach, close enough that Tanaka could smell the sake on his breath. The route he'd chosen was insane, through the mailroom, into the ventilation shaft, across a gap that required jumping between buildings with the cable dragging him down, then through a window that had been shattered by American bombing raids 3 months ago. Every moment, he expected a shout, a bullet, or the simple failure of his own trembling muscles. But what drove him forward wasn't just duty or patriotism, it was the memory of what he'd heard at 1 a.m. that morning, when he'd been asked to test the recording quality. He'd been the first person outside the Imperial Palace to hear the Emperor's voice on those records. He'd heard the tremor in Hirohito's words, the weight of thousands of years of tradition being crushed under the necessity of the moment. He'd heard a god become a man. And Tanaka had realized that if the Emperor could make that sacrifice, he could carry a Godam cable. He emerged into the basement studio 23 minutes later, bleeding from a dozen cuts, the cable intact. Goto grabbed it without a word and began connecting it to the broadcast system. They had 40 minutes until noon. Then the door at the top of the basement stairs exploded inward. Chapter 10: The Final Confrontation. Colonel Endo descended into the basement like an avenging angel, his pistol leading the way, but what stopped him wasn't the gun that Goto grabbed, a rusted old revolver that probably didn't even work, but the expression on the chief engineer's face. Endo had seen that look before, on soldiers who decided they were already dead and therefore had nothing to fear. "You're going to have to shoot me first," Goto said quietly. "Then my assistant. Then probably everyone else in this room. And even then, I've already connected the system to the emergency relay tower. You'd have to destroy that too. And the mobile broadcast units. And you know what? Even if you somehow managed all that, even if you killed every engineer in Tokyo and demolished every piece of equipment, the Americans already know the Emperor has surrendered. They are already preparing for the occupation. All you'd accomplish is making Japan look like chaos, divided, violent, unable to accept reality. Endo's hand wavered. Not because he doubted his convictions, but because Goto had just articulated the one fear that cut deeper than any other, that his actions wouldn't save Japan but humiliate it. The Emperor has made his decision, Goto continued, and now his voice carried the weight of something beyond mere technical expertise, moral authority. We don't have to agree with it. We don't have to like it. But it's done. The question is whether we're going to help Japan move forward with dignity, or turn this into a bloodbath that dishonours everyone who died believing they were protecting the nation. For 17 seconds, no one in the basement breathed. Then Colonel Endo did something no one expected. Chapter 11. The Decision That Saved Thousands. Endo lowered his pistol, and then he did something even more shocking. He sat down on the floor, right there in the middle of the basement, and buried his face in his hands. The other officers looked at each other, uncertain, weapons still raised. But Endo spoke without lifting his head, a stand down. His voice was hollow, defeated. It's over. The weight of that admission seemed to age him 20 years in 20 seconds. One of his officers, a young lieutenant barely out of his teens, began to cry, not quietly, but in great, heaving sobs. Another slammed his fist into the wall hard enough to crack the plaster and possibly his own knuckles. But the guns went down. The crisis passed. Goto slowly lowered his own useless revolver and felt his legs nearly give out from the adrenaline crash. In that moment, he understood something profound. Endo and his men weren't monsters. They were true believers who just watched their entire worldview collapse. In another context, their loyalty might have been admirable. But wars don't end when the last bullet is fired. They end when the losing side finally accepts that continuing to fight would cause more suffering than surrendering. Japan had just taken that step. Goto glanced at the clock. 11:47 a.m. 13 minutes until the broadcast. Then the door opened again, and an elderly man entered whom Goto recognized immediately, someone who had absolutely no business being there, and whose presence meant something had gone terribly wrong with the records themselves. Chapter 12. The Emperor's Secret Messenger. Marquis Koichi Kido, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal and one of the Emperor's most trusted advisors, looked at the assembled engineers and military officers with eyes that had not slept since the atomic bomb had vaporized Hiroshima. His presence in this basement was unprecedented, a high noble in a building under siege, and everyone immediately understood that the situation was even more dire than they'd thought. The first record, Kido said without preamble, is too damaged to broadcast. The audio is nearly unintelligible. Goto's heart sank. They'd focused so much energy on just getting the records to the station and defending them that they hadn't fully tested both discs. The second record, Kido continued, it contains the complete speech, but... He paused, and in that pause, everyone heard something that terrified them more than bullets or bombs, uncertainty from a man who never showed uncertainty. The Emperor used language that none of you will understand. He refers to the surrender as enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. He never uses the word surrender or defeat. The speech is written in classical court Japanese that perhaps 5% of the population can fully comprehend. This was worse than a damaged record. This was a failure of communication at the most critical moment in Japanese history. Millions of people would tune in, hear their emperor's voice for the first time ever, and have no idea what he was actually saying. Kido looked at Goto. Can you add an explanation? A translation into modern Japanese? Goto checked the clock. 11:53. 7 minutes. What Kido was asking was technically possible but utterly unprecedented. To editorially modify the emperor's words, even to clarify them, could be seen as a form of treason. But if they didn't, Japan might not even realize it had surrendered. Chapter 13. 7 Minutes to Rewrite History. Goshu made the decision in less than 3 seconds. We'll broadcast the Emperor's speech exactly as recorded, but I'll add a preliminary announcement in plain Japanese explaining what people are about to hear. He grabbed the microphone script pad and began writing faster than he'd ever written in his life. The words had to be precise, clear enough that everyone would understand, but not so informal that they disrespected the Emperor. Behind him, his assistant frantically prepared the playback equipment while another engineer spliced the cable connections to ensure clean audio. Kido watched in silence, and Goshu realized the Marquis was there not just as a messenger but as a witness. If this broadcast somehow failed or was mishandled, Kido would personally report the failure to the Emperor himself. The weight of that thought nearly paralyzed Goshu's hand, but he forced himself to keep writing. 11:56 a.m. 4 minutes. He finished the preliminary script and handed it to an announcer, who read it through once, his face going pale as he understood the magnitude of what he was about to say. Colonel Endo, still sitting against the wall, spoke up suddenly. Will you say that soldiers who fought with honor did not fight in vain? It was such a raw, vulnerable question that Goshu felt unexpected empathy for this man who'd been ready to kill him minutes ago. I will, Goshu promised. He added one sentence to the script, words not commanded by the Emperor or approved by any authority, but words that needed to be said. The courage and sacrifice of all who served Japan will echo through the ages. 11:58 a.m. The announcer moved to the microphone. 120 seconds until history turned on this single moment. Then the electrical system made a sound that every engineer dreads. A.